What's going on, everyone? Got a good video for you today. So I've interviewed hundreds of Salesforce developers over the last 12 years I've been in the industry, and there are just some glaring mistakes that developers make when interviewing for jobs or preparing for them, and I just wanted to highlight these two because they are red flags that could immediately get you rejected, especially among higher-end Salesforce development teams. Now, this is really good advice that no amount of money really can buy, so I hope you enjoy it. And let me also say, all the HR people and lawyers watching this video, this is information I've picked up throughout my long career in the Salesforce industry, and none of this is specific to my job at Google, nor does it have any impact on what we do. So don't get too mad at me. I'm just trying to make the world a little better of a place. Plus, you can go ahead and look at my numbers, and you'll see I don't make squat here, so we're good to go. Let's jump right into this. So the number 5 mistake Salesforce developers make when interviewing for jobs is not having any Lightning experience. There is still a substantial percentage of companies that are still using Salesforce Classic or are still in the process of migrating to Lightning. And if you're working at one of these companies, it means you're not learning and developing yourself in the latest Salesforce features because you're stuck at a company that's trapped 10 years in the past. Now, one might think, big deal, the person's company won't migrate to Lightning. That's not the candidate's fault, and that's true to some extent, but it does tell the interviewer a lot about the candidate. For one thing, the interviewer now knows that the candidate was unsuccessful at convincing their company to migrate to Lightning. This is bad because if the candidate is applying to a higher level role, being able to influence those around you is important, especially when it comes to technology that your team owns. Or an even grimmer interpretation of this is that the candidate simply never brought up the topic of migrating to Lightning because the candidate is lazy and doesn't care. Definitely not the type of candidate that high-level companies want to bring on board. But the more important thing it tells your interviewer is that the candidate was satisfied working in a low-performing environment for possibly the past 7 years, which is when Lightning was released and when Salesforce stopped building new features for Classic. Now, 7 years is a long time to be cruising, and it would be understandable if Lightning has only been released for a handful of years, or the candidate is new to the industry and just hasn't had the chance yet to evolve. But generally, Lightning has been around long enough that the candidate should have done something about their situation by now, either by changing companies or convincing their company to switch. What if you hire the candidate and they cruise doing the bare minimum for another 7 years? It's just a risk that companies can't take. So if you're stuck at a company right now that has not yet fully transitioned to Lightning, do yourself a favor, protect your career, and switch to a company that is 100% on Lightning as soon as you possibly can, or at the bare minimum, start writing a ton of LWCs in your free time. All right, moving on. The number 4 mistake that Salesforce developers make when interviewing or preparing for interviews is not being good at standard Salesforce reporting. Now, this may sound silly, but experienced Salesforce professionals know that reporting is everything in the Salesforce world, even if you're not even using Salesforce reports. Let me tell you why. First of all, reporting is extremely important in the very first phase of a project, which is requirements gathering. Your project's reporting requirements have a big impact on how you design your solution. Heavy reporting requirements leads to more complicated data models with more objects, relationships, and automation. Simple reporting requirements leads to a simpler solution that favors ease of use over data. And no reporting requirements means your project is probably going to fail because there is no vision or rigor over what you're building and why. So, if a Salesforce developer isn't good at reporting, this tells the interviewer that they're really not involved in the requirements gathering review process, which means the developer is more of a one-dimensional resource. But that's not all. Because the design of a solution is influenced so much by reporting requirements, having little reporting knowledge means that the developer either does not design the solution themselves or they're just bad at it. How do you decide whether to solve a requirement using 5 extra custom fields or by creating a child object? Well, you look at the reporting requirements and build the data model accordingly. All right, but what if your company doesn't do any reporting in Salesforce and instead farms all of the reporting to other teams using other systems like Tableau or MicroStrategy? Well, Salesforce reporting knowledge is still very important here because Salesforce at its core is a data generating tool. It's probably the primary tool your company uses to generate data on your sales or service teams. The information that your sales reps are inputting into Salesforce, for example, is extremely important to your company's operations. The things you build in Salesforce will determine exactly what data you're gathering from your sales reps and how it's structured. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're reporting on this data from Salesforce, Tableau, or SQL because it's all fundamentally the same. And a good developer will know how to optimize their designs for the best possible reporting outcomes. All right, that's a fairly technical topic, and I don't want to get too much deeper than that. So the summary is, if a developer isn't good at reporting, they're also not good at requirements gathering or solution design. And it makes the interviewer wonder, what else is the developer not good at? Do they do 100% of their job using code and ignore all other point and click functionality? Well, that's a big red flag too that we'll also go into more later on. Let's move on. The number 3 mistake that Salesforce developers make when interviewing for jobs is not being a good communicator. Now, this is a really broad statement to make, so let me attempt to structure it into something more tangible. Communication in all forms, whether it's verbal or written, is important for every job. But it's especially important for developers because they spend hundreds of hours building something based sometimes on their interpretation of a single meeting or document. So if the developer is not able to communicate their questions, thoughts, or solutions in a way that's easy for other people of various roles to understand, there's a big risk of the developer spending a ton of time building the wrong thing. And since developers are often the highest paid people on a team, this translates to very expensive failures. But how do interviewers know if candidates are good communicators, and what can people do to improve on this skill? Well, let's talk about it. Let's communicate. Let's start with written communication. A candidate's written communication skills are absolutely important because these days most communication is through writing, either through emails or documents. And interviewers will see your writing skills in 3 ways. The first is through your resume. Is your resume easy to process, or do you have a resume that's 8 pages worth of fluff and BS? If it's the latter, the interviewer will assume that you write your emails and documents similarly. This is why I always push for the 1-page resume. The second way interviewers will evaluate your written skills is through email. How do your email communications read before and after the interview? Are you concise, polite? Do you use proper grammar and punctuation? Are you sending thank you notes? All of these things add up. The final way interviewers evaluate your written skills is through your public information. What are you writing on your Twitter account, your LinkedIn, your Trailblazer profile? Have you asked or answered questions in the Trailblazer community? If so, what was the quality of your writing? These days, everything you do is public on the internet forever, and it will be scrutinized, so take caution with everything you do. Heck, one day, someone's going to be evaluating me and they might watch this video as part of their research. So that's the written portion. Now let's move on to verbal communication. Now this one's a lot more complicated because verbal communication happens in real time in unpredictable ways. So you don't have time to sit down and really think deeply about what you're going to say to the interviewer. So I'm going to recommend a few broad tips here. First of all, make sure to structure your answers in the interview process. Instead of throwing out your solutions all over the place as various thoughts hit your mind, do it in a structured, predictable way. For example, when explaining your solution, you might say, let me discuss the UX of my solution, then eventually go deeper into the data model, automation, security, and reporting design. A little bit of structure goes a long way. And if you need to buy yourself some time to think of the right structure, say so. You can say, give me a second to think about this, instead of just having an awkward silence where the interviewer is wondering if you're still there. Another tip for you is to change your communication style based on who you're talking to. The more technical the interviewer, the more depth you want to go into. If you're talking to a non-technical stakeholder, hold back on the details and focus on the higher level objectives. The more research you do on who your interviewers are, the better you'll do here. Finally, not a deal breaker, but something I recommend is to make sure to improve on your language skills as much as possible. For example, if I want to apply to Japanese companies long term, I would make sure my Japanese is very good, meaning I take classes on improving my Japanese and reducing my accent. I talk to my friends in Japanese, and if my friends don't know Japanese, I try to make more friends with people who do. And I'd even try to think in Japanese as much as possible. Not a requirement here, but everything you can do to improve how you communicate with others will help. All right, let's keep going. The number 2 mistake Salesforce developers make when interviewing for jobs is specializing too much. This often happens when the developer only has experience working on larger teams or companies. No one wants to hire someone who spent all their time writing only triggers but has rarely written any front-end code, for example. Similarly, no one wants to hire someone who has always been a small fish in a big team of people in their company. Someone who sits in a room, gets a very specific requirement that's well defined, codes it, waits for the next requirement, and repeat. Interviewers want to see people with broader skill sets who can contribute in multiple ways. This scenario often happens in interviews. The interviewer sees an interesting project on your resume because they're going through similar challenges and they want to pick your brain on how the project went. You'll go into some technical detail and eventually they'll ask a question like, why did you choose to go synchronous instead of asynchronous? Or why didn't you explore doing this using standard Salesforce functionality instead of code? The absolute worst thing a candidate can say in these scenarios is, I don't know. The architect or the business made this decision and I just built it. This is a bad response for a lot of reasons because, one, the candidate is just a robot fulfilling orders. Two, the candidate didn't understand the overall solution. Three, the candidate has no intellectual curiosity. And four, the candidate does not contribute any unique thoughts or perspectives to their team. These are all labels you want to avoid for yourself, so no matter what your situation is, try to get more involved in decisions outside of your core role. And if that's not possible, at the very least, try to understand how and why these decisions are made. Then eventually, maybe you'll build your solutioning skills to a point where you can contribute more broadly as well. Finally, the number one mistake Salesforce developers make when interviewing is not being good admins. It's often said in the industry that every good Salesforce developer is also a good admin, and this is absolutely true, and I'm with it 100%. Developers get paid the big bucks for a reason, and they gotta earn it. This includes, but is not limited to, knowledge on things like flows, process builder, sharing rules, roles and profiles, app builder dynamic layouts, and more. This scenario often happens during an interview. The interviewer will ask a candidate to design a solution to a problem, and the candidate will immediately jump to coding, which is often the nuclear option. Then the interviewer will ask why technologies such as Flow were not considered. And at this point, the candidate better be ready to go into deep technical details on the limitations of Flow technology, because the worst thing they can do is say, I don't know. I don't use flows very much. Because this will immediately brand the candidate as someone who over-engineers solutions and has had no curiosity in recent years to learn more about the ever-growing set of admin features in Salesforce. And at that point, the interviewer has lost all trust for the candidate to design good solutions for the team. This is just one example, and it could have applied to any other admin feature as well. So make sure as a developer, you're not just focusing on developer features, you're in tune with it all. Remember, you get paid the big bucks for a reason. Hope y'all enjoy this video and that it helps you in your next Salesforce interview or in your process of finding candidates yourself. Hope to see you around next time. Peace.